October 27, 2021. Only about 2 weeks before Remembrance Day, or in other countries, Armistice Day. The land area you see to the left, from your point of view that is what I calculate to be the area you need to provide a proper 90 centimeter by 200 centimeter burial plot for each one of those killed by that war, World War I, the Great War, Seminal Catastrophe, the 20th century. It would take at least 36.5 square kilometers to do this. And that's not even counting the pathways and space between each of the plots. I'm going to go around in a loop to show you just how big this is. And bear in mind I'm going at 80 kilometers per hour. Doing it, I might as well tell you some facts about that war and about conflicts generally. It was one of the first truly scientific wars, or at least industrial wars. There have been wars before that involved industry, such as the Crimean War and the Franco-Prussian War, but nothing on the scale of this. It was one of the big motivating factors for the Schlieffen Plan, for example, where the hypothesis was that if you get the German railways to deliver all your soldiers to the front before the French could, you could easily knock them out of the war and defeat Russia. You can probably guess how well that went, given that we don't have the same linguistic demographics that we do then. A man named Charles Sweeney, he once said that science is a key, and that same key will open the doors of heaven, but it can also open the doors of hell. It's not up to science to tell us how to use any of our discoveries. The same sorts of things like the Haber process invented during that war could be used to feed billions of people via the agricultural technologies that we've developed in the last century. Or it can be used to create chemical weapons. The airplane was thought to connect the world together, more so, and it would only be about 66 years between the first airplane and us going to the moon, putting men on there. Zeppelins and create fighter aircraft, create aces like the Manfred von Richthof. I'm mispronouncing that name. $20 million is a hard number to wrap your head around. But it's about the population of Canada when it had its centennial in 1967. It's also the population of 4.5 Albertas or close to the population of metropolitan Tokyo, the largest city in the world. Bear in mind, the population of the world was less than 2 billion people back then, so 20 million. That was more like 1 in every 100 people. Many of the great names of history date back to that war and what they thought of it. Old names were swept aside, like Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm II, or George Clemenceau, Tsar Nicholas II, all in favor of different names that would lead the world into the even bigger catastrophe of the Second World War, to the state of the deadliest war in human history. Names like Yosef Jugashvili, aka Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, Trotsky, Hitler, of course. One of his aces, or fighter aces from Germany of that period, he was famously affected by that war. He was a popular hero, but he joined up with the fascists in the war after the war. Fascism has an origin story in France too, in the ideology of revanche. It was the idea that France's victory and participation in the First World War would help to relieve the itch they felt from the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. It failed catastrophically. Things like the Croix de Feu, which means cross of fire in English, is an example of just how countries, even that didn't have fascism take over in the interwar period, how strong they would become, feeling this gigantic demographic change, how no one walked away from that war, sometimes literally with no feet, but in other cases having lost so much and having all of these ideologies that were supposed to preserve the world and make it better. It was 99 years between the defeat of Napoleon I and the Great War. It was a period without the with far fewer of the great powers conflicts, and many people had thought that war would have been impossible due to all the trade links between these countries, the growing interconnectedness between them all. You obviously know how well that happened in practice. Just like today with another kind of disaster that we're facing, people often don't know who an enemy is or how they should be defined, what measures should be taken against them, especially at first. All they know is that there's some kind of enemy to defeat out there. It initially rallies around the flag in many cases, but quickly get an idea of how Some leaders, of course, use it to their own ends and benefit only themselves and a tiny group. People often overestimate how democracy worked back then. Some countries had some kinds of democracy. Vladimir Lenin, of all people, praised America for having one of the largest suffrage franchises in the world at the time. Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were also high up in there, especially New Zealand with how women could vote. But even that didn't stop them from entering into the side of the Entente. These sorts of democratic checks are thought to help avoid a war, but they often don't in the way that you think it does. In some ways, some of these public protests made some leaders try to use the war to enter into one. Others not so much. After the war, a number of attempts were made to bring democracy to other places in the world. Japan got more democratic as it abolished property rights and voting, or more specifically tax requirements to vote. Germany adopted the Weimar Republic, one of the most democratic constitutions in the world at the time. And if you substituted the Constitution of Canada with it, it would even be better than its text would actually be better than the provisions that we had in 1914 or even 1920. The British adopted women's suffrage partially in 1918, going up to full suffrage in 1928. Poland became independent and had a parliamentary democracy for a time after Marshal Piłsudski, after he declined to take on the role of the presidency and become a strong leader for a while at least. The Soviet Union wasn't called the Soviet Union then. It was the Russian Federative Soviet Socialist Republic. At the time, they tried to hold an election in late 1918 or late 1917 for a constituent assembly. The Hungarians had a Soviet republic and then a different kind of republic. After the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria tried some democratic principles as well. Czechoslovakia became a democracy as well. But one by one, they had turned to with legitimate grievances like Bessarabia and its annexation by the Soviet Union, but others not so much. People didn't know what to make of those 20 years of peace, well, relative peace in the world, in Europe, that was. And it's not even really 20 years, if you ask me. It's more like the interwar period, 1924 at best, up until 1937. That would be when the Soviet Union was established and Japan finally exited that war. That's just really a continuation of World War I by a different name that wasn't really that distinct contemporaneously. Only by historical conventions is it made all that different. There were also massive decolonization wars of independence, and other kinds in places like Turkey, the Baltics, the Balkan states had their own attempts at hammering out these new borders that they would have. The Baltic states would be embroiled in a massive conflict with Poland and Russia to try and hammer out their new borders. Poland itself would have a major war with Russia, with the Soviet Union, 1921. Iraq would be bombed by Churchill's forces in 1922. As it had seemed like it would be for a long time in those days, it just got the short end of everyone's stick. And it was one of the big underrated fronts of those days. It had the British forces in Egypt. It would have them it would have other forces in Libya. It would have the German possessions in Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia, Togoland, Cameroon, Tanganyika, or modern day Tanzania. All those were fought over in the war. Appreciable ways on a global scale for a lot longer than 1918, which so would be. Got a lot of this kind of information, by the way, in case you're wondering, from a historian named Indiana or Indy Nidell, and the Time Goes production series, or the Time Goes production company, and their very series on the Great War, World War II a bit, the interwar period. And and other side productions like the Franco-Prussian War, Glory and Defeat. I suggest taking a look at them if you want to see a lot more. I'm one of the last people in the world born in the 20th century. A couple 100,000 babies born in the latter half of 2000, in the year 2000 would be a bit later than me, but I'm still one of the last of that century. Even though it's easy to forget that I was born then. I'm closer to events like Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter's presidency, of all things, than I am to today, or you are to today. Historical perspective can be weird at times. With all these dates. For example, there were people who had gone up as cosmonauts of the Soviet Union who were technically capable of seeing a Sailor Moon episode when they were up there, and they didn't come down until after that series had begun to air. Close to the starting point now, only a few more kilometers to go. But just think about how all of this land area crammed in every single square centimeter with a corpse of those years. How much land that was needed to bury that many people. A typical advance of the distance I can, that in a sentence I'm uttering like now, I already drive all that distance. That was the distance between trenches, often even less distance, and yet it took thousands per kilometer take it. It is said that you can move up a few meters just enough to take all the land that you need to bury those who were necessary to take it in the first place. I don't disagree. Reflections do you have about this war and what it means to you and your family, the history of the planet, and all of us Terrans who must inhabit it? All I know is that when there are over 10 billion people in that time space who have an opinion about it, there are at least 10 billion ways to think about it. It's likely that you won't have been the first to think whatever thought that you have.